What if a single act of kindness could change your life forever? When a successful but lonely businessman collapses on a busy bridge, an 11-year-old girl steps in to save him. But it's not the money or power that changes his fate. It's her simple request that leaves him speechless. What did she ask for, and how did it force him to confront a life of loneliness and greed? Prepare for a story of redemption, human connection, and life-changing realizations. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new update. Daniel Clark had always been a man of routine. Every day he awoke to the hum of the city outside his penthouse window in Manhattan. His mornings were precise, flawlessly orchestrated, just like his business empire. From the crispness of his tailored suit to the gleaming leather shoes that clicked against the marble floors of his apartment, everything was controlled. Everything was perfect. Yet there was one glaring imperfection: his life. In the sprawling metropolis below, a world of noise, energy, and life pulsed constantly. But up here, in his fortress of glass and steel, Daniel existed in a bubble of his own making. He had everything anyone could ever want: money, power, status. But inside, he felt an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. As he adjusted his tie with practiced precision, his reflection in the bathroom mirror stared back at him with a blank expression. A man who appeared to have it all. A man who had built a successful tech empire from the ground up. Yet somehow, that success had left him alone. His phone, often buzzing with notifications of meetings and stock updates, felt heavier each time he looked at it. A call from his sister Rebecca flashed across the screen. Missed call. He ignored it. After all, what was there to say? The last conversation they had felt like it happened in another lifetime, a time when family meant more than business. Daniel had pushed Rebecca away after their parents died. "I'm too busy with the merger," he had told her when she suggested they visit their parents' grave. That had been 3 years ago, and in all that time, he hadn't once picked up the phone to apologize. His focus on building his empire had become a shield against the pain of loss, against the loneliness he refused to confront. But that morning, staring into his own eyes in the bathroom mirror, Daniel couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He was lonely, and no amount of money could fill the void. At 7:30 a.m., Daniel stepped into the private elevator that descended to his waiting car, the doors closing silently behind him. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing in the otherwise empty elevator. The ride down was always silent, just the way he preferred it. He had never been a man who welcomed conversation. And even if he did, there was no one left in his life who truly mattered. The morning sun had barely risen above the skyline as Daniel Clark jogged across the Brooklyn Bridge. The cold air stung his face as he ran, his breath visible in the crisp winter air. The sounds of the city, muffled by the early hour, were drowned out by the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. He was alone, as always, lost in his thoughts, focused only on the future. There was no time for distractions. But today something was different. He felt a tightness in his chest that he initially dismissed as the result of pushing himself too hard. The pain worsened with each step, and soon it wasn't just discomfort. It was a sharp, crushing pressure, as if his heart were being squeezed in a vice. His legs buckled beneath him and he stumbled, barely managing to grab the railing for support. His vision blurred as his breath became shallow and erratic. He tried to call out, but his voice barely emerged as a whisper. He wanted to scream for help, but the words caught in his throat. He was surrounded by people, yet no one stopped. A jogger ran past him, headphones securely in place. Tourists snapped photos, oblivious to the man gasping for air just a few feet away. A young couple walked by, their laughter echoing in the cold air, unaware of the man on the ground. The bustling world continued around him, indifferent to his suffering. Daniel's thoughts raced. His life was slipping away and no one even noticed. The irony was almost too much to bear. For years he had been the one who controlled everything around him. His wealth, his business, his future, all of it had been in his hands. And now, in this moment of crisis, he was nothing more than a stranger on the sidewalk, his money useless, his influence meaningless. As the world faded around him, something unexpected happened. A small voice broke through the haze of his pain. "Mister, are you okay?" The voice was soft yet full of concern. Daniel opened his eyes just enough to see a young girl kneeling beside him. She couldn't have been more than 11, her face full of worry as she looked at him. Her hands were small, but they were warm when they gently touched his arm, grounding him in the midst of his panic. Before Daniel could respond, the girl jumped to her feet, her pigtails bouncing as she shouted into the crowd. "Help! Somebody help! This man is sick!" Her voice rang out with such urgency that for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. The girl refused to be ignored, waving her arms to gather attention. More people began to stop and gather around him. It took several moments, but eventually the crowd moved to action. Someone called 911. Others helped him sit up, and through the haze of his pain, Daniel heard the sirens approaching. The girl stayed by his side, holding his hand with an ease that he could not comprehend. Her face, framed by the fading sunlight, was a picture of genuine concern. As the paramedics took over, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He wanted to speak, to thank the girl, but his voice still failed him. Instead, he managed a weak smile, a silent acknowledgement that he had been saved, not by his wealth, but by the kindness of a stranger. Daniel woke to the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital room. The quiet hum of machines and the soft beep of his heart monitor were the only sounds in the otherwise still room. His head felt heavy, the dull ache from the heart attack still lingering in his chest. His vision cleared, and he slowly became aware of his surroundings. The bright white walls, the cold metal bed frame, and the muted light streaming through the window. For the first time in years, Daniel felt truly vulnerable. He had spent so much of his life controlling everything, his business, his wealth, his world. But none of that had prepared him for this moment. He had been lying on a bridge, helpless, completely dependent on the kindness of strangers. The cold, hard truth washed over him as he lay there, staring at the ceiling. His wealth, his empire could not save him in that moment. The door opened, and a soft voice spoke, pulling him from his thoughts. "Mr. Clark, how are you feeling?" It was the doctor. She stood by his bed, clipboard in hand, her face a mix of professional concern and kindness. She explained that he had suffered a heart attack but was stable now. "You're very fortunate, Mr. Clark. If it wasn't for the quick thinking of a young girl, things could have been much worse," she continued, her words taking a moment to register in Daniel's mind. "A young girl?" Daniel asked, his voice raspy. The doctor smiled gently, as if accustomed to the surprise in her patients' voices. "Yes, she was the one who noticed you on the bridge and called for help. She stayed with you the whole time. I understand she's been quite concerned about you." Daniel tried to recall the events before his collapse, but all he could remember was the sensation of being surrounded by a crowd of strangers. And then, the girl's face. Her eyes had been filled with concern, her small hands holding his arm. A sense of warmth had flowed through him in that moment, an unfamiliar feeling that he couldn't explain. "She saved my life," Daniel murmured. "I never even got her name." The doctor made a note on her clipboard. "Her name is Amara Jackson. She's only 11, but she acted with a maturity beyond her years." Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of her actions sinking in. A child, only 11, had shown him more compassion than anyone in his life. The realization hit him harder than the heart attack itself. He was used to being admired, feared even, for his wealth and power. But this simple act of kindness was something he could never have bought. Daniel's recovery was steady, but his mind raced with the events that had transpired. Each day, as he sat in his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling city below, he found himself reflecting on the heart attack and the girl who had saved him. Amara Jackson, her name echoed in his mind, a reminder of the selflessness he had never known. When he received a call from the hospital asking if he wanted to meet her, Daniel didn't hesitate. For the first time in a long while, he felt an overwhelming need to connect with someone. Amara, the girl who had been his lifeline, deserved his gratitude, and he needed to understand why she had been so willing to help him, a complete stranger. He arranged to meet her at a local park in East Harlem. a neighborhood far removed from his own world of wealth and luxury. As he entered the neighborhood, he was immediately struck by the contrast. The streets were vibrant, full of life and noise, with children laughing, street vendors calling out, and families gathering in the park. It was a place of warmth, of human connection, a stark contrast to the sterile isolation of his penthouse. Amara was waiting for him by the playground, her eyes lighting up when she saw him approach. She was with her mother, Cynthia, a woman in her early 30s with a warm smile but tired eyes. She was dressed in simple clothes, the kind of clothing that spoke of someone who worked hard every day. Her younger brother Tyrell was playing with other kids, laughing as he ran around. Amara greeted Daniel with the same sincerity that had saved his life on the bridge. "I'm glad you're okay, Mr. Clark," she said, her voice soft but genuine. Daniel knelt to her level, surprised by how natural it felt to be in this environment. "Thank you, Amara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life." Amara shrugged with a smile. "I just did what anyone would do." Her response made Daniel pause. "No," he corrected her gently. "Not everyone would." Amara's smile widened, and she gestured toward her mother, who had been quietly watching from a nearby bench. "My mom always says we help people because it's the right thing to do, not because we expect anything back." Daniel's chest tightened as he looked over at Cynthia. There was something profoundly different about the way Amara's family lived their lives. Despite not having much, they had community, something he had sacrificed in pursuit of success. He glanced around, noticing the small businesses, the vendors, the tight-knit families. Everyone seemed to be connected, helping each other in ways he had long forgotten. "What should I do to repay this kindness?" Amara replied, "I don't need money or anything, but can you come here to play with me often? It will be fun to have a playmate with me." At this moment, Daniel shed tears and thought to himself, why in the world is there such a person who is not materialistic and lives an honest life? Perhaps I have misunderstood something about this world. He quickly wiped away his tears and said, "Okay, I will often come here to play with you." Amara smiled from ear to ear and turned to him with a curious look. "Do you want to see the park? I can show you where I like to play." Daniel found himself nodding, despite not being the kind of person who ever took time to enjoy such simple pleasures. As they walked through the park, Amara proudly pointed out her favorite spots, where she played hopscotch, where she and her friends held impromptu games of soccer. She introduced him to other children, all of whom greeted him warmly, as if he were a long-lost friend. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something stir within him. This world, this community, was not the cold, transactional world he had built for himself. It was full of genuine connections, of people who cared for each other in ways he could hardly comprehend. And yet it was also the world Amara had saved him from losing. As they sat down on a park bench, Amara and Tyrell chattered away, and Daniel sat back, feeling an odd sense of peace wash over him. The weight of his business empire seemed so distant, almost irrelevant here. He was just a man sitting in a park listening to children's laughter. The realization hit him hard. He had been so focused on building a world of wealth, he had forgotten the importance of building relationships. He turned to Cynthia, his voice softer than usual. "You're raising your children well," he said. "I've spent my life chasing success, but what you have, it's something I've never really known." Cynthia's eyes softened, a hint of understanding in them. "We don't have much, but we have each other," she replied, her words simple but profound. "That's what matters." Daniel sat quietly, letting the weight of her words sink in. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profits or mergers. He was thinking about life, the kind of life that didn't come with a price tag, the kind of life he had been missing all along. The days following his visit to East Harlem left Daniel with a restless mind. His penthouse felt colder than usual, despite the temperature outside rising with the onset of spring. He found himself staring out the window, watching the bustling city below. But for the first time in years, the view didn't provide the comfort it once had. The glass walls of his tower, which once symbolized his success, now seemed like a barrier, isolating him from the world he had neglected for so long. The small moments he had shared with Amara and her family lingered in his mind. They had invited him into their world, a world where human connection was valued above all else. "We don't have much, but we have each other," Cynthia's words echoed in his mind. In contrast, Daniel's life, filled with wealth and status, felt empty. The realization gnawed at him with a quiet urgency. He had everything money could buy, but he lacked what truly mattered: love, family, and real human connection. Back in the sterile world of Clark Enterprises, the stark difference between the human warmth of East Harlem and the cold, calculated decisions of the corporate world became painfully obvious. Daniel sat in his office, staring at a report detailing the latest acquisition proposal. The deal was huge, millions of dollars in profits, the potential for market dominance, and yet, as he read through the numbers, a familiar emptiness crept in. This acquisition would mean the dismantling of a small, family-owned tech company. Jobs would be lost, families would suffer, and the only thing gained would be more power and wealth for him. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. His thoughts drifted back to Amara's neighborhood, to the people who were struggling to keep their businesses afloat, to the families that had to rely on each other for support. Was this the life he had chosen? Was this the kind of success that truly mattered? Daniel's internal conflict intensified as his assistant, Mark, entered the office with a stack of files. He briefed Daniel on the latest financial updates, but Daniel barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the memories of the park, of the way the children's laughter had felt more real than any business meeting he had ever attended. It was then that Daniel realized something he had been avoiding for years. The pursuit of wealth had never been the problem. It was his disconnection from what truly made life meaningful. He had been so focused on financial success that he had ignored the human cost, the toll it had taken on his relationships, on his ability to care about anything other than the next deal. Later that afternoon, Daniel stood at the large windows of his office, watching the city stretch out before him. It was beautiful, yes, but it no longer held the same allure. The view of the city, once a symbol of his success, now seemed like a reminder of everything he had lost in his single-minded pursuit of power. For the first time in a long time, Daniel wondered if the weight of his wealth had been worth it. Could he continue to build his empire, knowing that in doing so he was abandoning everything that truly mattered? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain: the time for change had come. He couldn't continue living this way. He couldn't keep hiding behind his wealth and achievements. There had to be more to life than what he had built in the glass towers of Clark Enterprises. Daniel's decision to block the acquisition had already set off ripples within the walls of Clark Enterprises. Whispers spread through the office, and many of his colleagues began to question his judgment. The deal was lucrative, so much potential for growth and expansion, but Daniel had chosen a different path. He had chosen humanity over profit. The decision left him unsettled, but the growing unrest within him only strengthened his resolve. As he walked through the sterile halls of his office building, the weight of his choices became increasingly clear. What was the true cost of success? He had built an empire on acquisitions, on swallowing up smaller companies, all in the name of power and wealth. But now, standing in the midst of all his achievements, he saw that these decisions were not without their toll. People lost jobs, families were uprooted, communities shattered, all for the sake of profit. This realization haunted him throughout the day. He found it harder to focus on the meetings, the numbers, the constant flow of business transactions. The faces of the employees he had worked with over the years blurred in his mind, the ones he had ignored, the ones who had sacrificed so much for the sake of his empire. It wasn't just the small company he had blocked from acquisition that bothered him. It was the entire system he had helped create. A system that put profit over people. A system that celebrated success while turning a blind eye to the human cost that came with it. Later that day, as he sat in his office reviewing the latest quarterly performance reports, he received a call from Cynthia, Amara's mother. Her voice, filled with warmth and concern, contrasted sharply with the cold, impersonal business calls Daniel was used to. She wanted to thank him for his donation to a local community program. something he had barely given a second thought to. But Cynthia's words stuck with him. Your help means the world to us, Daniel. It's not just about the money. It's about the message it sends. Someone cares. Someone outside of our community sees us. Her words hit him harder than he expected. Someone cares. That was it. That was what was missing in his world. No one truly cared anymore, at least not in the way that mattered. His business partners, his colleagues, even his family, they cared about profit, about results, but not about people. That night, as he walked through the quiet streets of his penthouse neighborhood, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for had come at a high human cost. He passed by the glossy high-end stores, the luxury apartments, the pristine cars, symbols of success, yes, but they felt empty now. He thought back to East Harlem, to Amara's laughter, to the warmth of Cynthia's home. It was a world he had been too blind to see, a world where people mattered more than the things they owned. In their small corner of the city, there was community, love, and support. And in his world, there was nothing, just more wealth, more acquisitions, more of the same cold, unfeeling machinery. Daniel paused at the edge of the bridge, staring out at the view below. He realized for the first time that the price of his wealth wasn't just measured in dollars. It was measured in lives. The lives of people he had left behind in his pursuit of success. And now, as he looked at the city from a distance, he felt a deep sense of loss, not for the business he had built, but for the human connections he had sacrificed. The weight of Daniel's decisions continued to press down on him, but with each passing day, he felt a subtle shift. The coldness of his former life no longer felt like the protective shell it once had. Instead, it was a prison. His heart, which had been closed off for so long, had begun to thaw. It wasn't just the work that had changed. It was his perspective on everything. The guilt he had been carrying for years, the strain with his sister Rebecca, was no longer something he could ignore. His mind often returned to their last conversation. He remembered how he had brushed her off when she suggested they visit their parents' grave. He had been too focused on work, too absorbed in his own empire to recognize what really mattered. Daniel found himself picking up his phone, the familiar weight of it now feeling heavier than ever. His fingers hovered over the contact for Rebecca, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate. He dialed her number. The phone rang for a few moments before her voice answered, sharp but familiar. Daniel? For a brief second, Daniel thought about hanging up. The silence between them felt like an abyss that he didn't know how to cross. But then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry, Rebecca, for everything. For not being there when you needed me. For choosing work over family. Rebecca's response was soft but steady. You don't have to apologize. I know why you did it. But I also know you've been carrying this weight all this time. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. His throat tightened. He hadn't expected this kind of forgiveness. I don't want to be the man I was, he admitted. I've lost so much and I didn't even realize it until now. Can we try again? Can we rebuild what we lost? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Daniel held his breath, unsure if this conversation would lead anywhere. But then Rebecca spoke again, her tone soft but hopeful. I think we can, but you'll need to show me, Daniel. Words are easy, actions speak louder. And that was when Daniel understood. It wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about proving it through actions, through change. He had spent his life building a legacy, but now he realized that the true legacy he wanted to leave was one of redemption, connection, and love. The following weeks were a time of rebuilding. Daniel began reaching out, not just to Rebecca, but to others in his life he had neglected. He spent more time with Amara and her family, taking part in local community events, genuinely connecting with people outside his corporate world. The experience was humbling. He realized that the connections he had been avoiding were the ones that mattered most. One afternoon, as he sat with Amara and her family at a community fundraiser, watching people come together to support each other, he felt something that had been missing from his life for so long: belonging. He had spent years trying to build his world piece by piece, but in the process, he had forgotten how to truly be a part of something greater than himself. As the day wore on, Daniel found himself talking to Cynthia about his past, about the choices he had made, and about the guilt that had weighed him down for so long. "I spent my whole life chasing something," Daniel confessed, his voice shaky, "and I thought it was enough. But now I see that it wasn't." Cynthia listened quietly, her expression kind but knowing. "You're here now," she said softly, "and that's what matters." Daniel knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready. He had taken the first step toward redemption. He had reconciled with Rebecca, mended old wounds, and opened his heart to the world he had once closed off. But more than that, he had learned that the true measure of success wasn't found in the bottom line of a company, but in the depth of human connections. The shift in Daniel's life had been nothing short of transformative. Every day he woke with a sense of purpose that had once been absent from his routine. The noise of the city outside his penthouse window no longer felt like a distraction. It was a reminder of the world he had once ignored. He had begun to see things differently, to feel the weight of his past mistakes and the promise of redemption. His time with Amara and her family, with people who truly valued connection over possessions, had opened his eyes to the world outside of his own. He began volunteering at local community centers, spending time with children in East Harlem, and helping small businesses navigate the challenges they faced. Each encounter, each conversation felt like a step toward healing, not just for him, but for the world around him. But it wasn't enough just to change his own life. Daniel knew that he needed to do more. He had built his wealth on the backs of others, taking from them while never giving back in a meaningful way. Now, he wanted to change that. It started with a small donation to a local after-school program. At first, it was a gesture, a way to show that he was serious about his new commitment. But as he watched the children light up at the news, as he saw the difference even a small amount of help could make, he knew that this was just the beginning. A few weeks later, Daniel sat at a meeting with his business associates, his heart pounding in his chest. "I want to create a fund for small businesses in underprivileged areas," he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "I want to give back in a way that goes beyond a one-time donation. I want to build something that lasts." His colleagues, many of whom had spent years chasing profits above all else, were skeptical at first. They saw it as an unnecessary risk, something that wouldn't make a significant impact on the bottom line. But Daniel's newfound clarity was unwavering. "The bottom line doesn't matter anymore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What matters is creating opportunities for people who've been overlooked for far too long." He launched the Clark Community Fund, a nonprofit initiative designed to support small businesses, youth programs, and local initiatives in neighborhoods like East Harlem. The impact was immediate. Local business owners found themselves with the resources they needed to stay afloat. Children who had been left behind in overcrowded schools now had access to tutoring programs, and families who had struggled with basic needs found support in their community. But the true success wasn't in the numbers, the reports, or even the public recognition. It was in the faces of the people he helped. It was in the small moments when a shop owner who had once been on the brink of closing his doors now stood proudly in front of a full store, or when a mother thanked him for giving her son the chance to attend a summer camp he otherwise couldn't afford. Daniel began to spend more time in the community, not as a businessman, but as a friend and supporter. He worked side by side with the people in East Harlem, helping them build something they could be proud of. His involvement wasn't about charity. It was about creating opportunities, about making sure that every person had a chance to thrive. And in doing so, he found that he was finally beginning to thrive too. Amara's words echoed in his mind often. "It's not about how much you give. It's about how much you care." He had started this journey thinking that wealth could solve all problems, but now he understood the true power of giving, not just money, but time, effort, and compassion. Daniel stood at the edge of the East Harlem Community Center, his gaze sweeping over the space he had come to know so well. It was different now, vibrant and full of life. The children ran and played in the yard, the sounds of laughter filling the air. The once struggling businesses on the corner now flourished, and the streets, once quiet and forgotten, buzzed with activity. This was a place of hope, of second chances, a place he had helped rebuild, not just with money but with heart. As he looked around, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The weight of his past decisions no longer bore down on him. The guilt, the regret, the isolation, all of it had melted away, replaced with a sense of fulfillment he had never known. He had given so much of himself to his career, to his empire, but now, for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly live. It had been a long and difficult road, but Daniel had found his way back to the things that truly mattered. He had reconnected with his sister Rebecca, rebuilding their relationship after years of distance. He had found love in the simplest of gestures, working side by side with the people he once saw as beneath him, understanding that success wasn't about what you had, but who you helped along the way. The Clark Community Fund had grown into a thriving support system for the local area, and Daniel had become a part of that community, not just as a donor, but as a friend. Amara, who had saved his life, was standing beside him now, smiling up at him with the same warmth she had shown when they first met. She was no longer the little girl he had met on the bridge. She was a young woman full of promise and potential, her bright eyes reflecting the future she had helped shape for her community. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "You really did it." Daniel smiled, his heart full. "We did it," he corrected her. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Amara. You were the spark that started it all." Amara's eyes softened. "No, you had the power to make it happen. You just needed to see the truth. That's what makes you different now." Her words stuck with him, as they always had. He had seen the truth in his journey, the truth that real success wasn't about wealth, but about the people you helped and the lives you touched. The bridge, the heart attack, the cold tower of his penthouse, all of it had led him to this moment, to this new beginning. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the community, Daniel knew that his journey was far from over. There was still work to be done, still people to help, still lives to change. But for the first time, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Daniel had found redemption, and with it, a new purpose, a new beginning.